5 countries, 3 time zones, 135 delegates. And we have made history with the first ever international Aga Khan Schools Model United Nations, or as we refer to it, AKS MUN.
Work on this Model United Nations began in August 2022 and kept picking up pace, bringing us to this moment when we are here with a heavy heart for the closing ceremony of the Aga Khan Schools Model United Nations. I, Tasin Al-Mamun,
And I, Mustafa Kapasi,
will be your hosts for this evening.
without further ado, let's get this show on the road. We are very, very excited to have in our midst someone who actually needs no introduction. Our guest of honor today is a legend known around the world for his tireless work for human rights and justice. He is none other than Justice Albie Sachs. Albie Sachs is an activist, writer, and former judge on the Constitutional Court of South Africa from 1994 to 2009. He began practicing as an advocate at the Cape Bar at the age of 21, defending the people charged under the racial statutes and security laws of apartheid.
After 2 spells of being detained in solitary confinement without trial, first for 5 months, then for 3 months, he went into exile in England, where he completed a PhD at Sussex University. In 1988, he lost his right arm and his sight in one eye when a bomb was placed in his car by South African security agents in Maputo, Mozambique. After the bombing, he devoted himself to the preparations for a new democratic constitution for South Africa. When he returned home from exile, he served as a member of the Constitutional Committee and the National Executive of the African National Congress until the first democratic elections in 1994.
Dr. Sachs is a board member of the Constitutional Hill Trust, which promotes constitutionalism and the rule of law. He has traveled to many countries, sharing South African experiences that could help heal divided societies. He is the author of several books, including The Jail Diary of Albie Sachs, Justice in South Africa, Sexism and the Law, Soft Vengeance of a Freedom Fighter, and The Strange Alchemy of Life and Law. His latest books are We, the People, Insights of an Activist Judge, and Oliver Tambo's Dream.
Sir, we are honored to have you in our midst. We can't wait to hear you address this gathering. I will now hand this over to Mr. Farhad Merchant, CEO of Aga Khan Education Service India, to take the conversation forward.
Thank you, Tasin and Mustafa, and welcome to Albie. As shared by our host, Justice Albie Sachs has played a prominent role in South Africa's struggle against apartheid and in the suppression of human rights. He's been a recipient of numerous awards, and including the recent Lifetime Achievement Award by the Clooney Foundation for Justice. They have also announced the Albie Awards that have been mainly to honor courageous defenders of justice who are at great risk for what they do. And it's a great privilege to get this opportunity to hear from him. We are very, very grateful indeed. Albie, let's jump right into it. It's been amazing, conversing with you and, trying to, put together this whole conversation approach that we are going to have today. So before we actually go into some of that conversation, if you could share some background about yourself and your motivations and inspirations that have shaped your decisions and took you in the direction that you have.
You use the word amazing. And, I look back on my life and to be quite honest, I can't believe it, that all these things happened to me. I'm just a quiet, rather dreamy person. And I was imprisoned, I was blown up, I helped draft South Africa's constitution. I had a big influence on where we put our new constitutional court in the heart of the old Fort prison, where we say with a very dubious pride, we South Africans have the only jail in the world where both Gandhi and Mandela were locked up. No one else can make that claim. Gosh, all these things happened to me. And when I think, okay, well, that's all in the past, 2 months ago, I'm sitting in the New York Public Library. There are about nearly 500 people there. It's jam-packed. There's a lot of energy. There's been beautiful singing and speeches. And I'm listening to Michelle Obama. And she's speaking beautifully with eloquent language about justice and this person who did this, that, and the other. And I'm enthralled. And I suddenly realize she's speaking about me. I'm carried away by her words. I'm not a spectator. I'm a participant in the proceedings. And the proceedings were the Amal and George Clooney Awards for people who fought for justice, fought courageously for justice. And there'd been a lot of correspondence between Amal and myself, quoting George, and it ended up with a very beautiful drawing by George showing a figure with one long arm, one short arm. And they asked the question, would I mind if in addition to giving me the award for lifetime achievement in support of justice, would I mind if the awards were called the Albies, like the Oscars, but the Albies? And I said yes. And now the moment has come for Albie to receive the Albie. It's kind of weird. It's kind of weird. In any event, I go up onto the platform and I asked Michelle beforehand, would it be okay if I embraced her on the platform? And she said, Albie, you can embrace me now, you can embrace me on the platform, and you can embrace me afterwards. Very, very gracious. And I felt, you know, there's some moments when you've got to hold back your emotion, but the other moments when you want to express your emotion, you want to show joy, you want to show connection. So just to stand there and say, thank you very much, I'm very humbled. This idea of saying I'm very humbled, at the moment you feel exalted, you feel ecstatic, and you're supposed to say, I'm very humbled. I didn't feel humbled at all. I felt ecstatic. And I felt it was so marvelous that Michelle Obama was part and parcel of the proceedings, and that she was saying the beautiful things that I was hearing. But then I picked up the statuette and I decided my opening words were going to be not thank you, Michelle, thank you, Mal and George, but hello, Albie. The room is filled with film people, theatre people. Meryl Streep had presented very eloquently, beautifully, an award to Maria Ressa from Philippines, a Filipina, brave journalist. And Julia Roberts had also very, very eloquently presented an award to somebody else, very, very meritorious. So it was a rich evening and an emotional evening, and song from Bruce Springsteen and other singers. John Oliver, the British comedian, was the compere. It was a lively, sprightly kind of a thing. And I said, hello, Albie. And I said, I must tell you that for a half of a quarter or a third of a nanosecond, I hesitated about whether I should accept this award and allow my name to be used for the award. And the reason was I've been an iconoclast all my life. And now I'm becoming an icon. What's going on? And 4 answers rushed into my head. The first was to say, more or less, don't get ahead of yourself, Albie. You could have been Nelson Mandela. You could have been Oliver Tambo, Mandela's partner. Very, very brave, wonderful leading figure. You could have been Griffith, a Black African brave lawyer who was assassinated in the struggle days. You could have been Victoria Mayange, his wife, who was also assassinated. You could have been Bram Fisher from Afrikaner background, who was head of the Bar Council during the day and at night doing secret work for the resistance, the underground, and eventually thrown into jail himself, dying of cancer, his body cremated, the ashes scattered so that there couldn't be a shrine to him. There's so many names you could have had, and they chose Albie because I'm alive and you can see my trauma. So it makes it easy to represent, to incarnate the kind of figure you want. Then I said, award figurines usually represent perfection. And what I love about you is you represent the imperfect body, one long arm, one short arm. And in a sense, all the people called disabled in the world who left out of awards now feel that they are also contemplated, that they're also included. Then I said, the name actually doesn't mean all that much. I'd actually looked up Oscar to find out who was the original Oscar. What had he done to deserve that fame for the Academy Awards? And it turned out Oscar was the uncle of a woman on their jury who was bald. And she jokingly referred to that little statuette, the Oscar, as Oscar, like Uncle Oscar. So his only claim to fame was not that he was a great actor, director, a producer, scriptwriter, composer of music, anything like that. His only claim to fame was that he was bald. And I said, the virtue that will be embedded in this award in future won't come from the name. It'll come from the people who get the awards. And look at the other marvelous people on the platform today who are getting the awards. And people covet the Oscar award, not because of Oscar, but because of all the people who've received the nominations and been chosen. And finally, I said, it's because of Amal and George, his two personalities, formidable and fun, great presence, hugely successful, both of them, and using their success not for promotion of themselves, but for promotion of justice. And it's not just something they're doing, it's part of their love, it's part of their marriage, it's part of their vocation. And I said, I'm particularly inspired by the fact that there's zest and energy in the project. So many human rights activities are gloomy, they're heavy, they're dour, they're filled with misery, how awful the world is. And we need people to denounce. We need people to name and shame. But if that's all you're doing, you're leaving a large part of your humanity out of the enterprise. There's a role for laughter, for fun, for music, for expression, for wit in the human rights activities. And that's what we've had this evening, a very rich program of energetic activities that I feel belong to the human rights movement. And George and Amal represent that kind of energy. So the audience stood up and applauded, a big ovation. And I said, I should leave it now, but I just want to also mention Darren Walker, the president of Ford Foundation, because they are supporting the project. And when I was blown up and I came out of hospital, Ford Foundation found funding for me, my first job after I'm out of hospital, helping to prepare the University of London, Institute of Commonwealth Studies, helping to prepare for a new constitution in South Africa. Also, I'd like to single out Alfred Woodard from Artists for a New South Africa, an African-American group of African-American film stars and producers and songwriters who gave us huge support in the struggle days. And she'd been invited, really at my request, to attend the gathering. And I sat next to her in the evening. And through you, Alfie, supporting all the other artists for a new South Africa who supported us in our struggle, but also the African American community in the United States, who had been the foundation of a very powerful anti-apartheid movement in that country, spreading to universities, spreading even to banks. Thank you, Americans who supported us in our struggle. And I tell you all this to indicate that I have, if you like, a complicated relationship with the idea of being singled out for praise and fame. Because I know in our struggle, we've always worked as a community, we worked in teams, people speak about unsung heroes, people who were so close to me, who resisted torture, who did marvelous things, to be in a way plucked out of that grouping and singled out as somebody very special, it does produce quite a degree of discomfort. But it's a comfortable discomfort, if you can understand. It's a moral discomfort, but a huge comfort in the sense that our struggle, our achievement, in the sense I'm representing everybody who struggled for justice in our country and all people in other countries struggling for justice. So I've told you this story because it, in a way, tells you quite a bit about my thinking, myself, and a bit about my past.
Absolutely. I think it has very beautifully brought that out. You know, your motivations and inspirations are actually from the people around you who have been part of that movement. I think you continue to draw that inspiration, you know, as you very eloquently shared about the event. It actually felt like I was present there and, you know, thinking about all the other people that that you singled out to talk about their contributions as well. So that's, it basically, I think the thing that I'm drawing from this is really the humility that an individual can have when they are, you know, working on something that allows you to kind of think of everybody else around it being plucked out and, you know, shown as somebody that is independently standing out. Really nicely put. Thank you, Albie. I will move on to a topic I think that is close to your heart based on the discussions that we had, and you know, throw that as a question across to you. What is participatory democracy and how does it shape the world? And maybe you can throw some light on that and we can probably discuss that further.
Okay, I'm going to reminisce a little bit. The young Albie, who's an advocate by day, in the court with my gown, saying, yes, my lord, no, my lord. There were no my ladies then. Enjoying the cut and thrust, the parry, the drama of cross-examination, even in these racist courts. Quite, in that sense, excited by the energy of forensic combat. But by night, I'm a revolutionary. I'm working with others to overthrow the apartheid state. And I was never involved in the armed struggle, but I supported the armed struggle because the majority didn't have the vote, had to carry passes to move from one place to the other, were dispossessed of the land, of rights, overwhelmingly poor, and no channels open to them to campaign against the injustices. So armed struggle as a component of a general popular struggle, an international struggle, general mass mobilization became something that I supported without ever carrying a gun myself or firing a weapon myself. And I'm a pacifist at heart, I might tell you in my soul, but even then it became necessary in my thinking to admire and support my colleagues and comrades who were brave enough to risk everything, and many died in battle, interrogations afterwards, and a few managed to survive even most horrendous tortures. So the theme of democracy looked very bleak in South Africa. All the talk about democracy for whites only democracy is somehow inherently a European idea, and Black people have to rule themselves in their tribal kingdoms, always as subalterns and dominated by the whites. So, okay, we decide through our Freedom Charter, democracy is the way forward. We don't want an independent South Africa. South Africa is independent. It has a seat in the United Nations. It's actually one of the founding members of the United Nations. But the white government are not allowed to sit in that seat because they don't represent the whole nation. So what we want then is a sovereignty that includes the majority, not just the white minority. And we decide our key thing is the vote. We don't want a separate South Africa. South Africa is there already. So our form of national independence was not to secede from the British Empire or the white racist empire, but to break down the internal barriers of exclusion, marginalization. And that came from the vote. And the most beautiful moment in South African history, and we've had lots of beautiful moments, without doubt, was the day we all voted as equals for the first time, 27th of April, 1994. And generally, there was this Afro-pessimism, democracy is not for Africa. After 300 years of vicious oppression, leaders locked up, overt racist rule, the Act of Union, which the British Parliament adopted, saying only white men can be in Parliament, expressly, only white men can be in Parliament. After all that, democracy can't work in South Africa, and it worked. And it worked because it involved representative democracy and participatory democracy unified through general elections for the first time, Black and white standing in lines for hour after hour after hour. There was one marvelous story of an elderly Black man in a rural area with no public transport, brought in a wheelbarrow to vote, and he wanted to vote before he died. So the vote, formal democracy, representative democracy, for us is enormous. It was our instrument of liberation, votes for everybody. So that's representative democracy. You choose your people who are going to govern and make the laws. You have a choice. They're accountable to you through regular, free and fair elections. That's huge. But, and once the major breakthrough comes through, the buts become important, all important. But it's not enough. It can be just a formal ritual. People can be disenchanted. They find in reality, the people they voted for aren't listening to them. Or you have to wait 5 years if you're dissatisfied. Or they're using the incumbency to wrap everything up to exclude opposition. There are all sorts of problems with depending simply on representative democracy. And also it gives too much power to the political parties, the people who dominate the political parties, and the lobby groups who influence through financing and other mechanisms, the political parties. So with that disenchantment, with this hard-won gains in representative democracy, one person, one vote, comes a push for participatory democracy. It's not the enemy of representative democracy. It's the counterpoint to it, but one that gives it continuing verve and significance. It's important for many reasons. One is it's ongoing. It's not, the way I put it in one decision of mine, like Sleeping Beauty is kissed into life once every 5 years by elections and then goes to sleep again. It's every day. More than that, it can be local. More than that, it can be all the small groups in society that are not well represented in the main big parties. Democracy then is not simply 50% plus one every 5 years when elections take place. democracy involves a continuing connection between the people exercising power and the people over whom or with whom that power is exercised. And it's particularly important in a very diverse society. India is a hugely diverse society. South Africa is a hugely diverse society. And it enables the multiple different voices, historical experiences, languages, cultures, all these different groups to have a voice, to be heard on a continuing basis. So it affects the texture of democracy. And I'll just conclude this talk with a case where the issue cropped up very, very vividly for us in the Constitutional Court about the distinction between representative democracy and participatory democracy. It was a case brought by a very conservative religious group against the finalizing by Parliament of a law that allowed for terminations of pregnancy, abortion, which is protected in our Constitution, the right to control reproduction is in our constitutionally protected right. Originally, the Law Termination of Pregnancy Act allowed only qualified doctors to perform terminations. The change was now to allow certain qualified senior nurses to do it. And this group wanted to object. They objected in the National Assembly, the main House of Parliament. They listened to and not accepted. They now wanted to object to the upper house, the National Council of Provinces. And the National Council of Provinces said, you don't have to come to Cape Town. We're going to send people out to the provinces and you can speak to us there. Suddenly, a few weeks later, the National Council of Provinces says, sorry, but parliamentary time doesn't allow us to send people out. So we're not going to have the hearings. So this conservative group came to the Constitutional Court and said the South African Constitution states that the legislature must take reasonable steps to involve the public in its activities. There's the textual basis for continued involvement. And until then, the thinking was involvement, you have the Parliament open, visitors can sit in the balcony, that there's a chance to make representation to the different committees, get hearings from the different committees. But now they were saying it goes further. It involves participation on the ground in your provinces. And we discussed it. We couldn't find any precedent in the world for striking down a law that had passed all the processes with the appropriate majorities simply on the basis that the public hadn't been given sufficient opportunity to intervene. And we decided the principles of accountability in our fundamental features of our Constitution require more than just elections every 5 years and following due processes for the adoption of bills that become laws. It requires ongoing, continuing connection with the people. And my thinking at first was, okay, we're going to say to Parliament, naughty, 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 don't do it again. Colleagues said, no, if you want the Constitution to work in the way it needs to be interpreted, you can't just say naughty, naughty, don't do it again. So we actually struck down the law. The first time, I think, that any court has struck down a law passed by the requisite majority, following the processes of representative democracy to the letter. Experience internationally and in our country have reinforced our instincts, if you like, our judicial thinking in this regard. And Parliament is much more attentive now, goes out much, much more. And amongst the bills that were being considered, I might mention that I could understand Parliament rejecting the claims of this conservative group. in the light of what our constitution required, a very powerful women's movement in favor of the right to choose over your body up to a certain stage when the fetus now becomes viable. Given all that, I could understand Parliament being not responsive to what they wanted to say, but I couldn't accept that Parliament wouldn't listen after they'd promised to have a hearing. They had decided, we'll give you a hearing. Once they've said that, that's reasonable, it becomes unreasonable to clamp down on the hearing that you've promised. That was the unreasonable part. So in a sense, what was a general kind of feeling and emotion that representative democracy is not enough, that it's failing our societies, that we need ongoing, continuing interaction with the full pluralistic character of our society, with all the small voices having chances to be heard on a continuous basis, was kind of a broad feeling that's expressed in many countries in the world, became consolidated in an actual decision by the Constitutional Court. The case, if anybody wants to follow it up, is DFL, Doctors for Life, versus the, I forget who, some figure in Parliament.
I'm sure Doctors for Life will give us the links to be able to follow it up. And I think this is amazing because when we talk about participatory democracy, I mean the whole idea of voting once as in the representative democracy, and then stepping back and expecting everything to happen the way we would like it to happen does not really work. Having a stake or a say in everything that is happening throughout the term of 5 years that the elected body is, I think will make a big difference. Taking accountability, being part of the process, ensuring that we have a voice in everything that is being said, and engaging, with the representatives that we have elected.
And if I can just add, can I just add that I follow up? So that was the one law. The other law that had promised hearings on was much more wide-reaching. It was a law dealing with traditional medicine. And for the first time, traditional healers who'd been excluded and rejected simply as superstitious charlatans, but millions of people go to traditional healers. They're enormously important in our society. For the first time, they were going to be acknowledged and brought within the frame of recognized medical practice, so that there could be interaction between scientific medicine and traditional healing. Very, very important. And for me, that was exactly the kind of grouping who should be heard directly. They're people who are often not familiar with the English language. They can't fly down to Cape Town to Parliament. They use local barks from bark from the trees and grasses and stones and bones. And their right to be heard is so important. And to say, wait for 5 years, you can elect somebody, it's not going to give them that umbilical connection that's so important for a thriving democracy.
I think it directly leads to the concept of using the law, the election process to actually bring inclusion, because it is about bringing people together and regardless of what walk of life they come. I think these have been great insights. I have one more question, and I also wanted to keep 5 minutes for some of the students' questions as well, Albie, if you don't mind. So largely, I just want to a message from you, in terms of what is your vision for the future and what role could these young boys and girls, these are in the age group of about 14 to 18 years of age, in shaping the world of tomorrow. So some thoughts around that. Quick 5 minutes, and then we'll switch over to the students because they've actually collated some questions as well.
Okay, well, I'm going to think back a little bit. You write and write and write stuff, and it goes out, and you forget what you've written. And then you find somebody saying, as Albie Sachs says, oh, did I say that? And one of my statements that's been very widely quoted is, we must always be skeptical of law's pretensions. I repeat that, we must always be skeptical of law's pretensions, but never be cynical about law's possibilities. Never be cynical about law's possibilities. So skepticism means blah, 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 blah. You don't just take it for granted. You don't just say, oh, because it's the law, it's good or useful. Law often promises a huge amount and produces very, very little. And law is often used for actual oppression of people, as happened under apartheid. But the potential of law, the potential to use law in a positive way, to develop your own life and career and express deep thoughts that you have and earn a living and connect up with others and be part of society. It's very strong in law. There are huge possibilities there. And if your ambition is to become super rich, I think there are other easier ways. It's never easy to become super rich, but you're not going to make a fortune out of being a lawyer unless you're part of a very favored few. But if the richness is internal, if it's a richness of using your skills, your talents, your ability with words to write, to speak, to connect, to understand, to think, to do research in a way that's going to be meaningful and helpful for other people, law really provides enormous opportunities for that. And what made me say immediately yes to your program and be involved with your program is the feeling I get that's exactly what you're aiming at. You're not aiming to produce smart-ass, clever, biting, snappy, important lawyers who are going to shine and elbow their way through. You encouraging people to connect up with other like-minded people, to be thoughtful, to be humane, to have that sense of humor and laughter and fun that I spoke about, together with seriousness and commitment. Those are the things that you have. And in my case, somebody looking at me with my short arm and hearing the story, the things that happened to me might say, well, Albie, you're not a very good example of, what it means to dedicate your life to a freedom struggle involving the law and using the law. But I just look back on my own life of intensely rich, intensely meaningful. And the luck I had was to survive, to get through. And that's fantastic. Happily, in order to do many of the things that I was able to do, you don't have to risk being thrown into jail. You don't have to risk being blown up. You don't have to have the isolations, restrictions, the police raids that I had. Each country will be different. In some, it might be even worse than it was in South Africa. But I think everywhere where the law is, where the sun shines, there are possibilities to have a life that is meaningful and rich and even brings you in a comfortable living.
Thank you, Albie. I think this has been absolutely amazing. And I think the important thing you mentioned over there is about the internal happiness that we have with what we do. The richness comes from that. Let's open up the floor to a few of the questions that have been received from the students. They have been collated by our Secretary General, Sahil Charnia. I will quickly hand it over to him. Sahil, 5 minutes. You can, as many questions as you can plow through that Albie can field. I will give you that. Over to you, Sahil.
Certainly. First of all, it's an honor, sir, to have you. And that honor is even more enhanced given that I myself am a lawyer by profession, just recently graduated. So I have a few questions for you. I'll begin with rather generic ones. What advice do you have for the younger generations here, the young kids in school, if they want to make a difference in life?
Okay, give me a cluster of questions. I'm going to have time for one answer, so there's a lot of overlap.
Okay. Next would be, your life has been a lot of struggle. I've been looking up you for since a while. And I think a life like that requires a lot of resilience. So what advice would you give us as a newer generation in terms of resilience so far as resilience is concerned? The third question is quite personal to me. Being a lawyer myself and being a responsible citizen, let's say, what advice would you give to citizens when it comes to obeying of unjust laws, the so-called unjust laws, when those laws are passed validly through constitutional procedures? Now, I would love to use terms like heartful debate and legal positivism and natural law theory being a lawyer, but I can't since we don't have the audience who would understand those terms. So how would you answer those questions, even given that morality is relative so far as time and culture is concerned? The last question I would say is, and perhaps you have answered that to a certain extent, would be there are some students here who would want to pursue law in future. So what would be your advice for them? And even for me as a young lawyer who has just graduated. Thank you.
I'll give one stock answer to people say, what advice would you, Albie Sachs, give to young people? And the advice is, don't listen to the advice of older people like me. Be as irreverent, as challenging, as questing, as curious, as intrepid as we were. We respected the older generation. We wanted to know their stories. We wanted to hear their stories, but we had to make up our own minds in keeping with where we were. And I think that made us resilient, because if you simply following advice of others, then the others die, sometimes they betray you, and you're following. It's that inner core of conviction that's so vital that you've got to produce for yourselves. And in terms of dealing with unjust laws, it varies enormously from country to country. In South Africa, it wasn't just unjust laws. The whole system, the constitution, was unjust, top to bottom. But we've used the law because they tried to impose apartheid through the law. We would use the law to defend ourselves and also to show possibilities for the future. And that was very contextual. So now when some people complain about laws in South Africa being unfair or applied in an unfair way, and they speak about we need a new revolution, we're pretty impatient with that. You've got the vote, you've got rights, you've got strong civil society, you've got a very robust judiciary, you've got a very activist constitution in terms. It's an activist constitution. Our constitution doesn't say we're living in a beautiful, marvelous country, don't rock the boat. The law's there to protect the status quo. Our constitution speaks about the injustice of our society. It speaks about achieving equality, achieving a non-racial, non-sexist society. So that dynamic is there. So to South Africans asking these questions, if they're dissatisfied, I'd say, use the rights that have been so hard won and mobilize. And it was done spectacularly by the Treatment Action Campaign, when our then president was denying the existence of the HIV, the virus, and people were dying in large numbers when antiretrovirals became available. The Treatment Action Campaign consisted of people, tens and tens of thousands of people, overwhelmingly poor, on the ground, in the communities, living with the virus, demanding access to the antiretrovirals. And when it wasn't forthcoming from a hesitant government, a reluctant government, with a very reluctant president, they mobilized in the streets, they got journalists to pick up their stories, and they brought a very well-directed legal action. And they chose as the test case, the case of a woman about to give birth, living with the virus, knowing if she takes the nevirapine antiretroviral, she will cut the possibility of transmission by 50%. Now it's by like 96%. And the government was saying, if you've got money, you can buy nevirapine over the counter. But for the others, we're going to be testing for 2 years in 2 sites in each of our 9 provinces. And people say, we can't wait for 2 years, we need it. The drug's being provided free by the manufacturers. It's safe, otherwise nobody could use it. And it's unreasonable under our constitution, which includes social and economic rights, not simply as directive principles, but as enforceable rights. And for me, if I had to single out one moment in my 15 years on the court that stands out maybe above any other, it's the moment when I was leaving the court and we'd seen sitting in the back of the court people with T-shirts saying HIV positive, black, white, brown, male, female, young, old. Dead silence when we told the government that they were under a duty to make the antiretrovirals available when the doctors prescribed it, the mothers wanted it. It was a constitutional legal duty. Dead silence. And as we left the court, cheering started, and I started crying. And I cried not just because of the impact of HIV on our people, but feeling I'm part of a project. I'm a judge on a court enforcing a constitution that guarantees rights we hadn't even thought about when we drafted the constitution. It was an overwhelmingly beautiful, emotional moment for me. It was like tears of joy. And that's an indication of what can be achieved by the law, through working with the constitution, through selecting judges who are have that empathy and sense of history and compassion, not just formal technicians, and through presenting well-prepared cases, thoughtful cases, well argued with good evidence. It was a wonderful example of what can be done through the law, a wonderful example of what lawyers can be and can do, whether you preparing the brief, whether you're arguing, whether you're the judge sitting up there, whether you're contesting it from the other side, because it's always important to hear every side to every argument. So I think that's the note that I would like to end on. There've been huge disappointments, enormous problems in my country. There's been a lot of deceit and many people who fought heroically for freedom behaved in very crooked activities years afterwards. But I still feel the great majority of South Africans support the general thrust of our constitution, want a decent, dignified society, are proud of our history and of our achievements, and see in the constitution the mechanism around which we can rally to deal with the heavy problems that we're dealing with today.
Thank you so much, Albie. I think we have kind of run out of time, but I will request you to, before handing it over to the host, I will request you to stay back with us as we go through the rest of the closing ceremony. We have at one point we will have the winners announced for the MUN debates today, and we'd love to. The students actually would love to have an opportunity to take a picture with you. So please stay on, and I'll hand it over back to the host for the day.
I'm just going to run away for a quick cup of coffee, and I'll be right back.
Thanks,
So please continue.
Well, thank you, sir, for the work you continue to do to make our world a better place. We are truly inspired by your life and your words. And thank you, Mr. Merchant, for facilitating this discussion, as well as Mr. Sahil Chania and all of the students present here to ask those thoughtful questions.